Shabbat Shalom again. As many of you may know, for the last, let's say, 10 days, I missed 2 Shabbatot here because I was leading a congregational trip of about 30 NSCI folks in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. And the trip was an amazing trip, as they always are. I'll share a little bit more about it at a later Shabbat. But on this trip, one of the congregants with us showed me something amazing. We were in a local restaurant in Tel Aviv looking at a menu in Hebrew. For some reason, they must have thought we were locals, which I guess is an incredible compliment, because usually they can spot an American a million miles away. But for some reason, our group received menus only in Hebrew, and this congregant held up his cell phone, putting the camera over it, and through the technological innovation of Google Translate, which now has an image decoder, what you saw on the screen was the Hebrew, but translated into English. It was amazing. I've never seen this before. I didn't even know it was a thing, and my husband works for Google, and he hadn't even shared that with me. But it was really, really cool, and they used this feature throughout our time there to translate anything. They would just hold their camera up at a billboard, a sign in a hotel, anything written in Hebrew, and they could presumably understand what it said. With one little hiccup, the translation accuracy of this new Google feature is 57%. So while it did recognize familiar words like pizza or hummus, the more specific items proved somewhat challenging. And this was, I think, one of the funnier examples. There's a common Israeli dish that's made up of stewed fava beans in a red wine reduction sauce. And Google translated it, or better said, mistranslated it to Paul also plundered hard wine. So, you saw on this menu, pizza, hummus, whatever, and then Paul also plundered hard wine, which I don't think is anything anyone wants to eat. So, it was an interesting exercise in the power of translation. The definition of translation, as you likely know, is to turn, usually a word, words, or some text, into one's own or another language. But translation is challenging because, first, not every language has the same words. Second, often one word in a given language can have many literal meanings even before a translation is attempted. So think of the word in English, for example, like nail. Am I talking about a thing I hammer into wood? Am I talking about the things at the tips of my hands or toes? Right? So depending on the usage, that can completely change the meaning of the word, as in the case of fava beans, which is pool in Hebrew, or fool, versus Paul. And of course, context and connotation, which are necessarily particular and also at the very same time, totally subjective. And oftentimes, mistranslations are benign, or even funny. But sometimes they're really significant and consequential. So I want us to think for a moment about the 7 or perhaps 8-day festival in which we find ourselves right now. What's it called? Good. Pesach, you said, so that's the Hebrew name. What's it called in English? Passover. Okay, so now let me ask you a question. You've gotten both of those right. What does Pesach mean? Okay, good. So paschal lamb. Interestingly, paschal is just a Greek or Latin deviated word which means Passover, right? Which is interesting. I searched the etymology today just because I anticipated that someone would say paschal, right? But many of you just said, oh, isn't Pesach Passover? Right? No? Well, Susie, you speak Hebrew, so you know you can't do it. Susie snowbirds in Tel Aviv for 2 months a year, so she's a shill, but she didn't know about this sermon in advance. if you're going to ask the question, what does Pesach mean? The truth is, it's a tricky question. The word Pesach is mentioned in the original Hebrew of our Hebrew Bible a limited number of times, and it actually isn't defined there. So, to know what Pesach means, it depends on translation and interpretation, which is always aligned with translation. There is no translation without a lens of interpretation. So the word Pesach, it comes from a word that's used to describe a specific type of ritual offering or sacrifice called Pesach, or Pasach, basically referring to a lamb that each ancient Hebrew family was told to sacrifice and then apply its blood on the tops and sides of the doorways of their home. You can think about the movie The Ten Commandments for this imagery if you don't have another reference for it. And this sign was some sort of indicator to God, who when seeing it would pasach and not let the Malach HaMavet, the destroyer, the mashchit, as it's said in Torah, in to your home. The Torah then instructs us that this ritual is one for all time and for all Jewish descendants. And then it says, and when our children inquire, what's this ritual to you? And you know of this biblical verse. Did anybody do the whole 4 children thing at your Seder? It's literally in response to this Torah question. The Torah gives us what we're supposed to say. The answer is, we are to respond, it is the Pesach sacrifice to God because God pasached the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when God smote the Egyptians. So it uses that word in probably about a 6-verse section 3 times, never with defining what it actually means. Pasach, Pesach, Pasach, it says. So it's easy, though, when I say it that way, to see how Passover fits. Think about the storyline. What's God doing? Seemingly passing over the houses. And that definition is one of the translations of Pesach. But it's not from a Jewish translation. Does anybody know what translation it's from? If you're like a biblical, geeky kind of person. The Latin, which is good. Jody, you just said it? The Vulgate. Right? So in case you're like, what, the Vulgate? There are lots of different translations of the Hebrew Bible throughout time. The Vulgate is a translation of the Hebrew Bible through any number of Greek translations into Latin for the Christian church in the 4th century CE. And it's highly influential in how we, not just Jewish people, but all people, understand what that word, Pesach, might mean. But our ancients, Jewish ancients, looked to the Jewish traditions and translations of Torah to translate it. And there you find something very different. So specifically, if you're looking for what's most commonly understood as the way our ancestors understood words in the Hebrew Bible, in Torah, you look to something called Targum Onkelos. Targum Onkelos is a biblical translation from Hebrew, or ancient Hebrew, into, I'll give you a hint, Yit Gadal ve'Yit Kadash, Aramaic, the language of the common people spoken at the time. Not the language of the educated, but the language of the every person. And there, in Onkelos, you get a much more accurate picture of how Jews understood Torah, its content and connotation, and listen to how Onkelos translates that same set of verses. Here's what Onkelos says. God will see the blood on the lintel and the doorposts of the houses, and God will, Pasach, be compassionate and not let the destroyer enter your houses to smite. And when your children ask you, what's this ritual to you? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Pesach, of compassion before God, who had compassion upon the houses of Israel in Egypt when God smote the Egyptians. And interestingly, it turns out that the Hebrew word Pesach has parallels in Arabic, also meaning compassion, which lets you know that it's more likely accurately translated by Onkelos for the intention of the original text than by the Vulgate. Just if you had to weigh it out, Latin, not a paired language with ancient Hebrew, Arabic, a partner. On the difference between understanding Pesach as Passover or compassion, I read this beautiful piece the other day by Yair Rosenberg. He'll actually be here at the end of this month as our Davis Family Forum scholar, speaking about anti-Semitism and why so many people still don't understand it. But he wrote a beautiful drash on Pesach, and here are his words. Rather than marking a morally antiseptic act of omission, the passing over of Jewish homes, instead the holiday celebrates a deliberate act of compassion toward an enslaved people and calls on us to emulate that divine conduct ourselves. What an amazing twist on what Passover might invite us into. Passing over is almost an incidental act, a sacrifice of compassion. That's not. When we commemorate Pesach, we're commemorating compassion and reminding ourselves that without it, none of us would be here. And to that I'd add that the understanding of Pesach offers us deeper insight into why the Torah would want us to practice and teach this ritual, not just back then, but in every generation, in every Jewishly identifying home, for all time. Not solely for the sake of retelling the same story so we can appreciate the redemption of our ancestors, but I think more importantly, so we can, through imitatio Dei, our mimicking of God's behavior in our own lives, actually catalyze a greater redemption for everybody through benevolence, through compassion. Isn't that the whole reason we set out the cup and open the door for Elijah at every Seder, but he never shows up? Harvey Cox, a theologian, teaches this. What does it mean that there is never anyone at the door? What if, for all practical purposes, no Messiah can be counted on? Would that make any significant difference in the way we engage in the present human enterprise? The responsibility to usher in a better tomorrow, a redemptive future, we don't abnegate ourselves from that. Passover invites us to effectuate it. The power to do that, it teaches, is in our hands and our hands alone. Forever to make it to Jerusalem, that symbol of a world that's healed and whole, we shouldn't be relying on Elijah to bring that sort of compassion. We should be doing that work ourselves. Every day we have the choice. Do we want to act like Pharaoh, or do we want to act like God? Will our hearts be hardened, or will they be open? Every act, every word, every gesture. And thankfully, acts of compassion like this, they don't require any translation at all. Shabbat shalom.